In the winter of 1855, an entire family vanished, father, mother, 4 children, swallowed by the cold Kentucky mountains. The official story: a tragic mine collapse. The truth: far worse. This was no accident. It was a calculated act of greed and murder, planned in smoky boardrooms and carried out in the shadows of the coal hills. A crime so well hidden, it would take more than 30 years before anyone dared speak the truth. And when that confession finally came, it exposed the bloody birth of corporate America's most ruthless era. This is the story of the Kellermans, a family who found a fortune in the Kentucky highlands, and were destroyed for it. The setting. In 1855, the Kentucky highlands were a different world. Far from the bustling streets of New York or the factories of Philadelphia, tiny towns like Pine Ridge clung to the sides of the Appalachian Mountains. Life was tough. People lived off the land, cut timber, hunted game, and, if they were lucky, found work in the early coal pits that were just starting to fuel America's growth. That's where Heinrich Kellerman comes in. Heinrich was a German immigrant who came to Kentucky in 1848. He wasn't just any farmer. Back in Germany, he'd worked the deep coal mines of the Ruhr Valley. He knew how to read rock, follow a vein, and spot the difference between worthless shale and black gold. Locals thought he was a fool when he bought 43 acres of rocky hillside for just $87. The land was so barren you couldn't graze a goat on it. But Heinrich had a different idea. The Kellerman family. Heinrich's wife, Martha, was just as tough. She had strong hands, sharp eyes, and a way of making their one-room cabin feel like a home. Their children, Johann 16, Maria 14, Wilhelm 11, and little Elizabeth 3, were mountain kids through and through. They spoke German at home, English in town, and worked hard without complaint. The Kellermans weren't rich, but they were building something. A life. A future. The discovery. By the fall of 1854, Heinrich had been digging shallow pits and tunnels on his hillside. The coal he found was good, better than what most local miners were pulling up, and he began selling small loads to towns nearby. People started whispering about the Kellerman luck. Then, in February 1855, everything changed. One cold morning, Heinrich broke through into a natural cavern. What he saw made his heart stop. A wall of coal, thick, pure, and stretching farther than his lamplight could reach. This wasn't just a good find. This was a fortune. Enough high-grade coal to supply the factories of Louisville for decades. Later, experts would estimate the value at over $200,000, a staggering sum in those days. And it all sat on land Heinrich owned outright. But in the booming world of 19th-century coal, news like this didn't stay secret for long. The enemy. Word of the Kellerman strike reached Louisville within a week. In the grand office of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company, Managing Director Jeremiah Whitlock listened to the report with growing irritation. Whitlock had been quietly buying up mineral rights across Harlan County, aiming for total control of Kentucky's coal. His methods: a mix of legal trickery, political influence, and, when needed, intimidation. The Kellerman land was a hole in his map, a small property he'd ignored because it seemed worthless. Now it was sitting on the richest vein in the region. And Heinrich, he wasn't part of the plan. The visit. Whitlock sent his best man, Samuel Briggs, to Pine Ridge. Briggs was cold, calculating, and never took no for an answer. He offered Heinrich $1,500, 20 times what the land had cost. Heinrich politely refused. Briggs raised it to $3,000, then $5,000. Still, no. Finally, Briggs leaned in close and spoke in a low, measured voice. Mines are dangerous places, Mr. Kellerman, especially for people without the right friends. Heinrich didn't need a translation. He'd seen this kind of threat before in Germany. He ordered Briggs off his land. Briggs left with a parting shot. Think carefully, Mr. Kellerman. The mountains can be dangerous for folks who don't know their place. The pressure. After that, strange things began happening. The Kellerman's mail stopped arriving. Stores in town refused them credit. Men were spotted watching the property from the ridgelines. In Louisville, Whitlock tightened the screws. Bank trouble, false legal claims, anything to bleed Heinrich dry. But Heinrich fought back. His paperwork was perfect. He started selling coal directly to buyers in Cincinnati and Nashville, bypassing Whitlock entirely. By late 1855, Whitlock's monopoly dream was crumbling. Worse, word was spreading. An immigrant had stood up to the big coal company and won. The decision. That's when Samuel Briggs came up with a new plan. He'd studied the Kellermans for months. He knew they all worked in the mine together during winter, from before sunrise until after dark. If something happened inside the mine in the dead of winter, no one would question it. Mine accidents were common. Immigrant families often lacked safety gear. Briggs laid out the plan in Whitlock's office on a freezing December night. Whitlock hesitated for only a moment. The coal was worth millions. The Kellermans were in the way. And in the ruthless math of Gilded Age America, 5 lives meant nothing. To be continued. In Part 2, you'll hear exactly how the Kellermans' fate was sealed, and the chilling events of the night Pine Ridge went silent forever. Part 2, The Pine Ridge Solution. Hook. December 10, 1855. Deep in the coal country of Kentucky, a decision was made that would end 6 lives. In the company ledger of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company, it was called the Pine Ridge Solution. To everyone else, it would be remembered, if at all, as a tragic mining accident. But make no mistake, this was not nature's doing. This was murder, designed in an office, carried out in the shadows, and disguised so perfectly that no one would question it for 34 years. The plan takes shape. The date was set for December 23, 1855, 2 days before Christmas. On that day, the Kellerman family would be working in their deepest tunnel, far from the entrance, with the winter cold slowing any rescue. Whitlock's right-hand man, Samuel Briggs, arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days early. He checked into the only boarding house, posing as a surveyor studying new railroad routes through the mountains. Strangers were nothing new to Pine Ridge. Coal fever had brought plenty of them, so Briggs barely drew a glance. What no one knew was that in his luggage, hidden beneath maps and tools, were several sticks of dynamite. Officially, they were for blasting rock in railroad planning. In reality, they would be the weapon that wiped out an entire family. The reconnaissance. For 3 days, Briggs watched the Kellermans. He mapped out every step of their routine, when they entered the mine, where they worked at certain hours, when they took breaks. The mine's wooden supports, built by Heinrich himself, were solid. But Briggs didn't need weakness. He was going to create it. By placing his charges just right, he could cause a chain reaction, a cascading cave-in that would trap the family under tons of rock. And when investigators came, it would look like a tragic accident in a poorly reinforced immigrant mine. A warning unheeded. Meanwhile, Heinrich Kellerman was restless. Martha noticed it first, the way he kept checking the mine supports, running his hands along the beams, muttering in German about bad timber and loose rock. On the night of December 21st, Heinrich told Martha about vivid dreams he'd been having, dreams of the mine collapsing with his whole family inside. Martha ever practical, told him to trust his instincts. They even talked about leaving for a few days to visit her sister in Nashville. But winter was when the mine produced its best coal, and they needed the money to expand in the spring. They decided to work 2 more days, then take Christmas week off. A fatal slip. Unfortunately, young Johann overheard the plan. Proud of the family's success, he told other kids in town about their Christmas mining schedule the next morning. From across the street, Briggs heard every word. That was all he needed. The timing problem he'd been struggling with had just been solved. The night before, on the evening of December 22nd, Briggs moved. Under the cover of darkness, he crept to the Kellerman property. With a lantern shielded from view, he set the dynamite charges in the main tunnel, placing them at key support points. When they blew, the ceiling would buckle, the sidewalls would give way, and the collapse would rush down like a wave, sealing off the deepest chamber first. Briggs knew exactly how to make it look natural. He'd studied real mine disasters across Appalachia and could replicate the telltale signs. Snapped beams, crushed timbers, the way rock shifted under certain pressures. He even had a ready-made geological report, blaming the collapse on immigrant shortcuts and unsafe methods. The Last Supper. That night, the Kellermans sat down for what would be their final meal together. Heinrich laughed about the fine Christmas gifts they could afford that year. Martha baked Christmas bread from her family's German recipe. Wilhelm chattered about the mining cart his father had promised to build. Maria helped clear the table while little Elizabeth toddled between her parents. They had no idea that less than 12 hours later, they would be gone. The morning of December 23rd. The day dawned gray and bitter cold. A sharp wind sliced through the Kentucky hills, promising snow by nightfall. Before sunrise, the Kellermans began their routine. Martha packed bread, cheese, and coffee for lunch. Heinrich checked his tools by lamplight. The children bundled up, their breath turning to white clouds in the frigid cabin. From his hidden perch nearly a quarter-mile away, Briggs watched through field glasses. He had the mine entrance and access road in clear view. At 6:47 a.m., Heinrich lit the first lantern and led his family inside, walking straight toward their tomb. The perfect timing. Inside, the family worked as always. Heinrich and Johann attacked the coal face in the deepest section. Martha and Maria loaded the carts. Wilhelm carried smaller pieces and kept the lamps bright. Baby Elizabeth played near her sisters in the warmer chamber. Briggs had timed it all. The dynamite was set to detonate at 10:15 a.m., the exact moment the family would be at their furthest point inside. Too early, and they might be near the entrance. Too late, and they might have started their midday break. But 10:15 was perfect. The complication. At 9:30 a.m., something happened Briggs hadn't planned for. Thomas Hartley, a local farmer, walked up to the mine entrance calling for Heinrich. He wanted to buy coal for the winter. From his vantage point, Briggs froze. If Hartley went inside, he'd either die with the family, or worse, survive and become a witness. Hartley stepped closer to the entrance, calling Heinrich's name again, his voice echoing into the dark tunnel. For several long minutes, Briggs watched in silent panic as the farmer lingered, standing just yards from the spot where, in less than an hour, the mountain would come down. Cliffhanger. Would Hartley step inside and ruin the plan? Or would he turn away, leaving the Kellermans to their fate? The clock in Briggs' pocket ticked toward 10:15. Part 3 whispers beneath the iron sky. The morning after the explosion, a pale mist clung to the tracks. The air still smelled faintly of burnt oil and scorched wood, as if the land itself had not yet decided to forget. Workers moved along the site with quiet precision, shoveling debris into wagons, repairing twisted rails, and wiping soot from their faces. But beneath the clang of hammers and the hiss of steam, there was a silence far heavier than the wreckage. Men nodded to each other in passing, their eyes darting away as quickly as they met. Everyone seemed to be talking without speaking, conversations left unfinished, questions swallowed before they could leave the tongue. At the center of it all, the company foreman, Mr. Caldwell, stood like an iron statue. His coat was spotless, his voice steady, his orders sharp. But the way his jaw tightened each time someone approached told another story. This was a man holding something in place, something he could not allow to shift. "Clear the west line before noon," he barked. "We'll run the 8:15 as scheduled. No delays." A few men exchanged uneasy glances. The 8:15 ran dangerously close to the damaged section. It would be safer to suspend service for a day, maybe more. But no one said so aloud. Thomas, a young brakeman with soot still streaked across his face from the night before, couldn't shake the sound he'd heard when the boiler went. Not the roar of fire or the screech of iron, but the hiss, long, sharp, almost deliberate, just minutes before the blast. He had told himself it was nothing. Pipes hiss all the time. Pressure builds, steam escapes. But now, with the wreckage spread before him, the sound haunted him. He found himself near the engine shed where the damaged locomotive had been dragged. Its once polished brass fittings were blackened, its wheels bent like twisted spoons. Standing beside it, he noticed something odd. The safety valve had been replaced. Brand new, gleaming against the soot. It made no sense. A safety valve, replaced overnight. And who had the authority to do it without logging it in the repair ledger? Admiring the wreck, boy. Thomas spun around. It was Mr. Graves, the chief engineer, a man with hands like steel and eyes that missed nothing. He was smoking a short, foul-smelling cigar. "Just checking the damage, sir," Thomas stammered. Graves exhaled a plume of smoke and leaned closer. "Best check nothing at all. Some things ain't meant to be seen." The warning was casual in tone, but the weight behind it settled cold in Thomas's stomach. By midday, the station bustled with unnatural cheer. Company men moved among the passengers, offering free coffee and assuring them the railway was strong as ever. The newspapers that morning carried only a brief mention of the explosion, calling it a minor mechanical failure. No one had died, they claimed. The report did not mention the two bodies Thomas himself had seen carried away under canvas. The cover-up was complete before the ashes cooled. But not for everyone. Down near the loading yard, Samuel Hart, a wiry mechanic with a face carved by years of soot and wind, pulled Thomas aside. Hart was not the kind of man to waste words, but when he spoke, people listened. "You were near the east tank before the blast, weren't you?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "Did you see anyone?" Thomas hesitated. He remembered a shadow slipping between the coal carts, a figure in a dark overcoat. At the time, he thought nothing of it. "Yes," he said finally. "But I don't know who." Hart's jaw tightened. "You're better off not knowing. And if you're smart, you'll keep your mouth shut. These tracks run on more than steam, they run on power. Cross the wrong man, and you'll find yourself under them." That night, Thomas lay awake in his boarding room, staring at the ceiling while the distant rumble of passing trains shook the floorboards. He thought of the replaced safety valve, the shadow in the yard, the sharp hiss before the explosion, and he thought of the way Mr. Caldwell had smiled, too quickly, too widely, when the company inspector announced the accident was an unfortunate but isolated event. It was clear now, the explosion had not been an accident. Someone had wanted it to happen. and someone else had made sure no one would ever prove it. The question was, why? In the days that followed, repairs continued with unusual speed. The 815 ran without incident, but Thomas noticed guards posted near certain sections of track, men who were not railway workers. They stood with arms folded, eyes scanning, hands resting a little too naturally on the grips of their coats. One afternoon, Thomas overheard a fragment of conversation between Mr. Caldwell and an unfamiliar gentleman in a bowler hat. "Timing has to be perfect," the man said. "The shipment leaves Wednesday night. No delays. No questions." The rest was lost as the station bell rang. But a chill crept down Thomas's spine. The railway wasn't just moving passengers, it was moving something else. Something worth killing over. By the week's end, whispers began to spread among the workers about a special cargo locked in the freight vault. Some said it was gold. Others claimed it was a shipment of rifles bound for the Western Territories. Whatever it was, Caldwell guarded it like a dragon. One evening, Thomas caught sight of Samuel Hart slipping into the engine shed long after his shift had ended. Curiosity overrode caution. He followed at a distance, keeping to the shadows. Inside, Hart was kneeling beside a crate, prying at its lid. A faint metallic glint shone in the lamplight. Before Thomas could see more, a voice echoed from the doorway. "Step away from that crate, Mr." Graves stepped forward, his cigar glowing in the dim light. His other hand rested on a revolver. Hart froze. "You've been around long enough to know better," Graves said, his voice low but edged with steel. "This isn't your concern. And it won't be his, either." His eyes flicked toward Thomas in the shadows. Thomas's breath caught. He realized then that his life had just shifted onto the same dangerous track as Hart's. Whatever was hidden beneath the iron sky of the railway was more than a secret, it was a threat. And someone was willing to bury the truth, one man at a time, to keep it moving. As the train whistle howled in the distance, Thomas knew there was no turning back. The tracks were set, the engine was already moving, and he was standing right in its path. Part for the fire that wouldn't die. The winter of 1851 pressed down on the small riverside town like a cold hand on the throat. Ice formed along the edges of the water, and the wind howled through the skeletal branches of the elms. The town moved slowly, wrapped in wool and suspicion. Everyone remembered the night the factory burned, not just the flames, but the whispers that followed. Jonathan Hale remembered it most of all. He had not been in the building when the fire started, but in the weeks that followed, he felt as though he were trapped in it still, surrounded by smoke, struggling to breathe. Investors had pulled their money. Contracts had been cancelled, and those who had once spoken his name with respect now lowered their eyes when he passed. For most men, that might have been the end. But Jonathan wasn't. Most men. The letter in the ashes. A month after the fire, while walking the blackened remains of the factory floor, Jonathan's boot struck something solid beneath a drift of charred timber. He knelt and brushed away the soot. It was a small iron lockbox, warped from the heat. The keyhole had melted shut, but with a hammer and determination, he forced it open. Inside was a stack of papers, ledger sheets, supply lists, and at the very bottom, a letter. The handwriting was hurried, uneven. It named suppliers who had been paid off to deliver inferior materials. It hinted at a competitor's involvement, a man whose handshake in public had always been warm, but whose smile never reached his eyes. The letter wasn't signed, but it was enough to confirm what Jonathan already suspected. The fire had not been an accident. It had been an erasure. He folded the letter, placed it in his coat, and made a silent vow. "They may have taken my building, but they will not take my future." The quiet rebuilding. Jonathan knew he could not confront his saboteurs outright, not yet. In a small town, accusations without proof could destroy a man faster than any fire. Instead, he began to rebuild in secret. He rented a weathered barn at the edge of town, far from the watchful eyes of the riverfront. There, by the light of oil lamps, he began to assemble a smaller, leaner operation. He salvaged unburned machinery from the ruins, repaired them with his own hands, and bartered for what he could not afford to buy. A few loyal workers, men and women who had refused to abandon him, helped in the shadows. They were paid not in coins, but in trust. They worked through nights so cold that their breath rose in clouds, their fingers stiff, their backs aching. But they worked. Jonathan told them what he truly believed. They think the fire has finished us. They think we will fade. But this is where they are wrong. The fire was not an ending. It was a clearing. And now we plant again. The seed of a bigger idea. As the new year turned, Jonathan realized something vital. His old business model had been a cage. He had worked under contracts that left him at the mercy of a few wealthy buyers who could be swayed or bought by competitors. If he rebuilt the same business in the same way, he would be vulnerable again. So he began to think differently. What if, instead of producing parts for other companies, he created a finished product he could sell directly to the growing towns along the river? He would not be a supplier at their mercy, he would be the name on the crate, the face behind the guarantee. It was risky. It meant competing in a wider market, facing bigger players. But Jonathan understood something that most never see. The safest path is often the most dangerous. Because safety breeds complacency, and complacency is a slow death. Turning enemies into teachers. In the months that followed, Jonathan did something that might have seemed foolish to an outsider. He attended gatherings and dinners where his suspected saboteurs would be present. He shook their hands. He smiled. He listened. But he was not there for friendship. He was there to study. Every man leaves a trail. Not just in ledgers and letters, but in the way he speaks, the details he forgets to hide. Jonathan watched for patterns, contradictions, and opportunities. His enemies became his unwilling teachers, and from them, he learned where the market was headed, which towns were hungry for industry, and which investors were quietly discontent with their current partners. A whisper of opportunity. One evening, in a crowded parlor thick with cigar smoke, he overheard two merchants complaining about a shipment delay from the city. Their supplier's warehouse had been damaged in a storm, and it would be months before repairs were made. Jonathan didn't interrupt. He simply listened, finished his drink, and left early. But the next morning, he sent a letter, not to the merchants, but to their customers. In it, he offered a solution: reliable delivery of high-quality goods within 3 weeks. It was an audacious promise, one that would require every ounce of effort his small team could muster. The first contract arrived a week later. Then another. By the end of the month, the barn was humming with activity. The fire that wouldn't die. By spring, the whispers in town had changed. Where once they spoke of Jonathan Hale in the past tense, now they spoke of him with curiosity, even unease. No one could quite explain how he had returned, stronger than before, with contracts in hand and a product line that bore his name. But Jonathan knew the truth. He had not returned from the fire, he had carried it with him. It burned in every decision he made. It burned in the quiet hours when others slept. It burned in his refusal to accept that the end of one venture was the end of him. And as summer came, that fire began to spread, not as destruction, but as light. Dash dash dash. Lesson for the reader. If you've ever faced a setback so complete it felt like the ground itself had opened beneath you, remember this: the loss is not the end. The fire that destroys can also reveal. In the ashes, you may find the letter, the clue, the truth that sets you on a stronger path. Jonathan's story is not about avoiding loss, it is about refusing to let loss define you. Because while fortune may be built in factories, it is forged in the flames that try to take them away. Part 5: The Turning of the Tide. The morning air carried the smell of wet coal and iron, heavy, almost metallic, as if the city itself were holding its breath. By now, months had passed since the sabotage at the yard, and though repairs had been made, the memory of that night still burned like a coal in the minds of those who had seen too much. Jonathan Briggs, once the quiet overseer with a ledger tucked under his arm, had changed. His gait was quicker now, his jaw set tighter. He no longer stopped for idle conversation with the riveters or the dock hands. He was moving with a purpose. And yet, not all wounds had healed. Rumors still drifted like smoke across the taverns, whispers that the accident hadn't been an accident at all. In corners where light barely touched the table, men would lean close, their voices low. It was a setup. Someone wanted that ship never to sail. But these were whispers only. Speaking them aloud in the wrong company could earn you more than a warning. Jonathan had kept his head down, playing the dutiful employee. But behind closed doors, late at night, he was assembling something far more dangerous than any ship, a network of truth-tellers. A blacksmith here, a dock clerk there, even a seamstress who kept her ear to the chatter of wealthy clients. One by one, they began feeding him details. A name half heard, a shipment logged twice, a payment with no invoice. It was in these scraps of information that the picture began to form. And the picture was ugly. The man at the center of it all, Jonathan now suspected, wasn't just an enemy of his company. He was an architect of deliberate ruin, a man willing to sink a vessel not for revenge, but for profit. To him, the workers were pawns, the ships were merely tools, and the sea itself was just another ledger to be balanced. Jonathan knew this was no longer about restoring a single vessel or defending a single yard. This was about ending the reach of a man whose shadow stretched across half the docks. But there was a problem. The man he hunted was untouchable. Too many hands had been bought, too many officials owed him favors. Confronting him directly would be suicide. And then came the break. One cold evening, the seamstress, Mrs. Eleanor Pike, sharp as a needle and twice as quick, slipped Jonathan a folded scrap of cloth with a note stitched into it in near invisible thread. It contained a time, a location, and 2 words: ledger transfer. If Jonathan's hunch was correct, this transfer would be the proof he needed. The ledgers would hold the records of every illicit payment, every bribe, every false repair report. And if he could get them, it would end this. The night of the transfer, the docks were near silent. Only the creak of mooring ropes and the occasional slap of water against hulls broke the stillness. Jonathan waited in the shadows of an empty warehouse, his breath fogging in the lamplight. Then he saw them. 2 men, both strangers to the yard, hauling a small chest between them. They moved quickly, but not hurriedly, a sign of confidence. Jonathan's pulse quickened. He knew there wouldn't be a second chance. When they paused to shift their grip, Jonathan stepped forward. "Evening, gentlemen," he said. His voice was steady, though his heart was pounding. One of the men froze. The other turned, hand drifting toward his coat. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you," Jonathan said. "I'll be taking it now." For a moment, no one moved. The air seemed to hold its breath. Then the taller man reached into his coat, and Jonathan lunged. The struggle was short, brutal. The chest clattered to the ground, spilling papers and ledgers across the damp planks. Jonathan grabbed as many as he could before the men broke away, disappearing into the dark. When he finally staggered into the lamplight of his small apartment, his hands were trembling. He laid the ledgers out on the table. Page after page of transactions, false names, and coded entries stared back at him. It was all there, but he couldn't take it to the company board, not yet. Too many there were compromised. If he made the wrong move, the evidence would vanish, and with it, any hope of justice. Jonathan decided instead to go higher, straight to a government inspector known for his refusal to be bought. The kind of man who would risk his own career to expose a scandal. The meeting was arranged under the pretense of a routine inspection. Jonathan handed over the ledgers, his fingers reluctant to let them go. The inspector didn't promise victory. He simply said, "This will do." Days turned to weeks. And then, one morning, the city awoke to the sound of boots on cobblestone and the clatter of iron gates being unlatched. The man Jonathan had hunted for months was led away in shackles. His allies scattered like gulls before a storm. The docks buzzed with the news. Workers shook hands in the open, their smiles no longer cautious. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as though the tide itself had turned. But Jonathan knew this was only one battle. Corruption had deep roots, and the work of cutting them away was far from over. Still, as he stood on the repaired deck of the ship that had nearly been lost, the wind filling its fresh sails, he allowed himself a small moment of triumph. The vessel was whole again. The crew was ready, and for the first time in months, the horizon looked clear. Part 6: The Unseen Bridge. The spring of 1857 had come with a strange stillness to the small riverside town. The icy grip of winter had loosened, and the first green shoots pushed through the thawing soil. Yet, beneath the beauty of the season, a quiet tension lingered, an air that only those who lived there could sense. James Whitlock, the man who had once been nothing more than an ambitious apprentice in the old machine works, now stood as the new head engineer for the railway project. His rise had been rapid, but not without resistance. Whispers still floated in taverns about the incident of 2 years prior, when the first bridge construction had mysteriously failed. Many blamed bad weather, some whispered of sabotage, but only James knew the deeper truth, that opportunity often hides itself in adversity. The bridge was being built again. Bigger, stronger, and this time, James was determined it would stand, not just as a structure of wood and steel, but as a symbol of resilience. A meeting of two worlds. One cool April morning, James received word that a man had come from the city to speak with him. When he stepped outside his small office by the worksite, he saw a figure in a black coat leaning on a cane, a man who looked more suited for a bank lobby than a muddy riverbank. "Mr. Whitlock?" the stranger asked, tipping his hat. "Name's Harrington. I represent a group of investors with interest in your bridge." James studied him. "Investors? The railway company already funds the work." "True," Harrington said, his voice low, "but progress, Mr. Whitlock, often needs more than one source of strength. We believe in your vision, and we believe in you." The offer was tempting. Harrington promised not only funds but also influence, connections, and a chance for James to design other projects in the future. But there was a condition. The investors wanted certain adjustments to the design to cut costs. Adjustments James knew could weaken the structure. He felt the familiar tug of two worlds, the world of immediate gain, and the world of lasting integrity. The decision. That night, James walked the empty length of the half-built bridge under the moonlight. The river rushed below, black and restless. His boots echoed on the planks. He thought of the first bridge collapse, the injured workers, the humiliation. He thought of his father's words when he was just a boy working in the iron shop, "A man's name is the only thing he builds that must never fall." In that moment, the choice became clear. The next day, he met Harrington at the edge of the worksite. "Sir," James said firmly, "if I build this bridge, I build it my way. No shortcuts. No compromises. If that means you withdraw your offer, so be it." Harrington's eyes narrowed, but he gave a small smile. "Very well, Mr. Whitlock. We shall watch from a distance. Let us see if your principles can stand as firmly as your bridge." And with that, he left. The test of leadership. Summer came, and with it, storms. Heavy rains swelled the river. Twice, the scaffolding on the west side was damaged and had to be rebuilt. Supplies ran late. Workers grumbled. The project fell behind schedule. One morning, as James inspected the framework, a foreman approached. "Sir, the men say if you'd just cut the lower truss beam like the investors suggested, we'd save weeks." James shook his head. "The beam stays. If we rush now, we risk losing it all later." The foreman sighed. "It's your name on it." "Yes," James replied quietly, "and I intend for it to stay there." The bridge and the man. By autumn, the final beams were set. The bridge stretched across the water like a promise fulfilled, solid, unshakable. The first train to cross did so on a crisp October morning, with townspeople lining both banks to cheer. The air was filled with the smell of coal smoke and the sound of iron wheels on steel rails. As the locomotive passed, James stood apart from the crowd, watching. He didn't need applause. The satisfaction was in knowing that the bridge stood because he had refused to bend his principles. That afternoon, a letter arrived. It was from Harrington. "Mr. Whitlock, I must admit, I doubted you. But your bridge has impressed even the most skeptical in the city. If you are ever ready to lead a greater project, you have my support, on your terms." James smiled as he folded the letter. Success had come, not because he sought to please everyone, but because he chose the harder right over the easier wrong. The unseen bridge. Years later, long after trains had crossed the bridge 1,000 times, people still spoke of its strength. But few knew the real story, that the greater bridge James built was not the one of timber and iron, but the one within himself. He had bridged the gap between ambition and integrity, between opportunity and principle, and that bridge, unseen by the eyes but felt in the soul, would outlast even the steel rails it carried. Lesson of Part 6. True success is not measured by what you build for the world to see, but by what you build inside yourself when no one is watching. A man, or woman, becomes truly unshakable when their values are stronger than any storm. Part 7. The Last Door. The wind had grown louder in the night, rattling the shutters like skeletal fingers scratching for entry. The old house seemed to breathe with it, the timbers groaning, the wallpaper whispering as if something pressed against the very walls. Eliza sat in the dim parlor, clutching the brass key she'd found hidden in the drawer of her uncle's desk. It was heavier than she expected, the teeth unusually long and sharp. She had not intended to use it. God knew she wanted to leave this place, not explore it further. But she couldn't shake the sound she'd heard just before dawn, a slow, deliberate tapping, coming from behind the locked door at the far end of the east hallway. That door had always been sealed. Even when she was a child visiting this estate, her mother had warned her not to approach it. "It leads to the rooms we do not speak of," her mother had said, and that was all. But the tapping had returned. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. As though whoever, or whatever, was inside was patiently waiting for her. She stood, the floorboards creaking under her bare feet, and crossed the parlor. The house felt different now. Not simply empty, but expectant. She passed through the hall where the grandfather clock had stopped, its pendulum frozen mid-swing. A thin line of dust on the floor ahead was broken by faint footprints, bare, narrow, and wet. Her breath caught in her throat. The footprints weren't hers. They led directly toward the east hallway. The candle in her hand flickered as she followed, casting long, crooked shadows along the walls. Here, the wallpaper was different, dark green, curling at the edges as if peeled away by unseen fingers. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something metallic. She reached the door. It was taller than she remembered, the wood blackened and warped. A single iron lock sat beneath the handle, large enough for the key she now gripped tightly. She hesitated. Her pulse thudded in her ears. Just look, she told herself. Open it, see nothing, and be done with it. The key slid in easily, the tumblers clicking one by one like bones snapping into place. She turned the handle. The door swung inward with a sigh. Inside, the air was cold, unnaturally so. Her breath billowed out in front of her. The candle's flame nearly died in the sudden draft, but she shielded it with her hand and stepped forward. The room was small, windowless, and lined with shelves. But the shelves did not hold books or trinkets. They were crowded with jars, each one filled with cloudy liquid and something pale floating within. At first, she thought they were dolls. But the closer she stepped, the more she saw the unmistakable details: tiny fingernails, closed eyelids, strands of hair drifting in the fluid. Infants. Her stomach lurched. A sudden noise behind her made her spin. Soft, shuffling footsteps in the hallway. Who's there? Her voice cracked in the cold air. No reply. She turned back toward the shelves. And froze. The jars nearest her had shifted. Their lids, sealed with wax, now showed thin cracks. A ripple moved through the liquid of the nearest jar, and the thing inside twitched. She staggered back, her candlelight sweeping across the shelves, only to find that all the pale shapes inside were stirring now, their limbs brushing the glass, their eyelids opening to reveal milky, sightless eyes. From the darkness of the back wall came another sound, wet and deliberate. A slithering, dragging shuffle, as though something enormous was moving toward her. She backed away, her hand fumbling for the doorframe. And then she saw it. It emerged from the shadows, taller than a man, its body obscured by a long, tattered shroud. Its head was wrong, too narrow, with a jaw that hung too low, exposing teeth like shards of glass. Its arms were long, almost touching the floor, and its fingers, dear God, they were jointed backward. In one hand, it held a jar. In the other, a length of black ribbon. It raised the jar to its mouth. Inside, the infant-like thing writhed. Without breaking its gaze from Eliza, the creature bit through the glass as if it were sugar, the shards grinding between its teeth. The fluid spilled down its chest. The pale shape inside was gone in a single swallow. The sound it made after was not hunger. It was satisfaction. Eliza's legs finally obeyed her. She turned and ran, slamming the door behind her, the key still dangling in the lock. She sprinted down the hallway, the candle gone, her only light the thin gray dawn through the high windows. Behind her came the slow, steady tread of something that knew she could not escape. She reached the parlor, fumbling for the front door, but it wouldn't open. Her hand slipped on the knob. It was slick with the same cloudy liquid she'd seen in the jars. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement by the fireplace. A shape, small, hunched, was crouched there, watching her. It was a child, or it looked like one. But its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and its smile was too wide, too sharp. "Mother's waiting," it whispered. Eliza backed away until she felt the wall at her spine. Somewhere deep in the house, she heard the door to the east hallway swing open again. And the footsteps came closer. Part 8: The Last Descent. The tunnels had changed. Lena noticed it first. The walls no longer dripped with the same cold water. The stone seemed wrong somehow. As if the centuries-old rock had been replaced with something softer, darker, pulsing faintly when the torchlight hit it. Behind her, Mark's breathing was uneven, every exhale a tremor. "We've been down here for hours," he whispered. His voice sounded far away, as if the tunnels swallowed sound as hungrily as they swallowed light. Hours ago, they'd fled down here to escape what had been following them above ground, the faceless thing that had hunted them through the abandoned asylum. But the further they descended, the more it felt as though they'd walked into its home. Lena's hand brushed the wall and she yanked it back instantly. It was warm. They passed a series of old iron gates, all hanging from rusted hinges, each one marked with the same crude symbol, a circle, split in two by a jagged vertical line. The mark was scratched so deep into the metal that it warped the frame. "What is this place?" Mark muttered, not expecting an answer. They found one anyway. At first, Lena thought the sound was dripping water again, but no. It was breathing. Slow, steady, deliberate. Somewhere ahead in the dark, something waited. The tunnel opened into a cavern that should not have been there. Its ceiling vanished into shadow, and along the edges stood dozens, no, hundreds, of figures. At least, they looked like figures. Some were the size of men, others as tall as the ceiling itself, but all were draped in what seemed like layers of rotting fabric. Faces, if they had them, were hidden. They didn't move, didn't sway, didn't breathe. They simply stood there, watching without eyes. Mark took a step back. The crunch of his boot on loose gravel was deafening in the silence. That was when they all moved. Not toward them. Not yet. The figures shifted as one, turning their covered heads toward the far end of the cavern. And Lena, following their gaze, saw it, an altar of black stone, slick with something that shimmered unnaturally in the torchlight. Above it, a hole in the wall breathed in and out like a lung. Something was inside, something alive. The breathing they'd heard earlier grew louder, matching the rhythm of the cavern itself. Then came the whisper. It wasn't in the air, it was in their skulls. "You came too far. You saw too much. You belong here now." Mark dropped the torch. It hissed and died in the strange wetness coating the cavern floor, plunging them into a darkness so complete it felt solid. Lena could hear him fumbling, hear his breath breaking into panicked sobs. And then she heard the figures step forward. It was not the sound of footsteps. It was the sound of cloth tearing and flesh stretching, wet and deliberate. She grabbed Mark's arm and pulled, running blindly into the dark. The cavern walls closed in almost instantly, becoming another tunnel, twisting and sloping sharply downward. There was no choice but to follow it, each turn feeling less like stone and more like the inside of something alive. Finally, light, faint, flickering. They burst into a smaller chamber, where a single oil lamp burned on the floor. Above it hung something that should never have existed, a door. It wasn't attached to any wall. It floated a few feet off the ground, old wood blackened with age, a keyhole in its center. The lamp cast shadows through the keyhole, but they were wrong, longer, sharper, moving against the light instead of with it. Mark staggered toward it. "It's a way out. It has to be." "No," Lena said, though she didn't know why. Every instinct screamed to run from it. The whisper returned. "Open it. Step through. Give yourself to the hollow." The figures were coming. She could hear them now, closer, the sound of the tearing and stretching echoing through the tunnel behind. Mark reached for the handle. Lena didn't have time to think. She yanked him back, and in the same motion, the lamp tipped over, spilling flame onto the floor. For a moment, the chamber was full of light, and she saw what the shadows had been hiding. The floating door was not a door at all. It was a mouth. The handle was a hook of bone, the keyhole, an unblinking eye sunk deep into the wood-like flesh. It was smiling. Mark screamed as the figures poured into the room, their rotting shrouds brushing the walls, their headless forms bending toward them. Lena grabbed the lamp again, swinging it wildly, fire scattering like molten rain. The mouth door shrieked, a sound that came from everywhere at once. The air grew thick, pressing against her chest, making each breath a battle. There was no escape, not forward, not back. The last thing Lena saw before the flame died was the eye in the door, wide and filled with a hunger so deep it had no end. And then, nothing but the sound of breathing. Part 9. The breathing. Walls. The night pressed heavy over the house like a shroud. No moonlight touched the windows now. Every pane seemed blackened from within, as though the glass itself had been coated in soot. Mara stood in the hallway, her breath shallow, clutching the dull silver blade she'd found in the study. Somewhere behind her, Thomas's footsteps creaked, slow, hesitant. "Did you hear it too?" he whispered. She nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. The sound had been faint at first, almost like wind in a chimney. But it wasn't wind, it was rhythmic, wet, and far too close. It was breathing. The walls themselves seemed to inhale and exhale, a deep, resonant pull of air followed by a slow, dragging release. The wallpaper shifted almost imperceptibly, as if something beneath it were stretching. "We have to get out," Thomas said, voice trembling. Mara shook her head. "If we leave now, it follows. You've seen it. We need to end this." They edged toward the parlor, the only room where the floorboards didn't groan underfoot. The air grew warmer the closer they got, tinged with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood, perhaps, though neither dared confirm. When they stepped inside, the fire in the hearth flared without warning. Shadows danced up the walls, their shapes not matching the furniture. They twisted, writhing, forming crude outlines of faces, open-mouthed, screaming silently. Thomas backed toward the door, but it slammed shut behind them. The breathing quickened. "Mara," he whispered, his voice breaking. The silver blade in her hand grew cold, almost painfully so. She turned toward the far wall, where the wallpaper had begun to bubble and peel. Beneath it, something pale and wet pushed outward, as though the wall itself were giving birth. The lump grew, split, and a slick, eyeless face pressed through, mouth gaping, teeth jagged and mismatched, each one twitching like an insect's leg. Thomas screamed and grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace. He swung hard, striking the wall creature's head. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, but instead of retreating, the thing's mouth opened wider, emitting a howl that made the flames gutter. The sound seemed to shake the entire house. The floor quivered. Dust fell from the ceiling like ash. And then, the breathing was no longer just in the walls, it was all around them, inside their heads, filling their lungs. Mara lunged forward, driving the silver blade into the creature's mouth. There was a blinding flash, and the thing recoiled, shrieking. The wall behind it rippled violently, as though dozens of unseen bodies were pressing forward, desperate to escape. The parlor door burst open, not from outside, but from within the wood itself, as if the door were tearing its own frame apart. Beyond it lay not the hallway, but a yawning black void. A cold wind rushed from it, carrying whispers in a language neither could understand. "Mara!" Thomas shouted, grabbing her arm. "It's pulling everything in." The hearthstones cracked. Flames and shadows alike were sucked toward the void, twisting into long, screaming strands. The wallpaper peeled in great sheets, revealing a living membrane beneath, slick and pulsing. The void's pull grew stronger. Thomas lost his grip on the poker and stumbled toward the door. Mara caught his wrist, digging her nails into his skin. "Hold on," she yelled. The silver blade pulsed in her hand, and without knowing why, she raised it above her head and brought it down into the floorboards. The moment the blade struck wood, a deafening wail erupted from the walls. The breathing stopped. For an instant, the entire house froze. No sound, no movement, only the smell of smoke and rot. Then, like a snapped thread, the pull of the void vanished. The black doorway slammed shut with a boom that shook the rafters. The living membrane beneath the wallpaper went slack and gray. Thomas collapsed to his knees, gasping. What just happened?" Mara stared at the silver blade. Its edge was blackened now, and hairline cracks ran along the length of it. "It's not over," she said softly. "That was just one of them." From somewhere deep beneath the house, far below the cellar, something knocked. Once, twice, then, slowly, 3 times. The sound was patient, and it was coming closer. If you want, I can now take part 10 into a full final climax where everything converges and the truth of the horror is revealed. That would wrap this arc in a cinematic way while keeping it around 1,000 words. Part 10: The Final Descent. The 3 knocks didn't fade. They grew heavier, each one vibrating through the floor like the heartbeat of some monstrous thing beneath them. Mara and Thomas locked eyes, both pale and shaking. "It's in the cellar," Thomas whispered. "No," Mara said, her voice low but steady. "It's below the cellar." The silver blade in her hand was dying, cracks spreading, its glow gone. If this was the only thing keeping whatever lay beneath from breaking through, they didn't have much time. The air shifted. Not just the musty stillness of the old house, the atmosphere itself seemed to press inward, as though they were being buried under invisible weight. Shadows stretched unnaturally, bending toward the trapdoor at the far end of the hall. They moved as if in a dream, slow but unable to stop. Each step toward the cellar door made the knocks louder. And with the sound came whispers, soft, wet syllables curling in their ears, speaking in a tongue that felt older than the earth. The words made no sense, yet their meaning sank deep into the marrow. "Come down, come down, come down." Thomas swallowed hard. "If we open that door, it will come out anyway," Mara cut in. "Better we face it before it's ready." The trapdoor's iron ring was ice cold under her fingers. She pulled. The hinges groaned, and a black void yawned below. Stale, cold air rolled upward, carrying the stench of earth long undisturbed, and something else. Something rotten. They descended the narrow wooden steps. Each creak echoed like a scream. The cellar was exactly as it had been before. Dirt floor, stacked firewood, the old furnace crouched like a sleeping beast. But there, in the far wall, was a new thing, an archway of wet stone, glistening as though freshly unearthed. Beyond it lay only darkness. The knocking came again, but now it wasn't 3 strikes. It was a slow, dragging scrape, as if claws were testing the inside of the stone. "Do you feel that?" Thomas whispered. Mara nodded. The ground trembled in tiny pulses, each one like a breath being forced through the soil. They stepped into the arch. The air changed instantly, colder, yet thicker, clinging to their skin. The tunnel sloped downward, its walls pulsed faintly, slick with a sheen that caught what little light remained. After a dozen steps, they saw it. At the end of the tunnel was a vast underground chamber, its ceiling lost in shadow. The floor was uneven, made of black stone and patches of flesh-like growth. In the center lay a pit, circular and impossibly deep. The sound was coming from there, a rhythmic, patient thud, like the knocking of a giant's hand against a door. Mara gripped the broken silver blade. This is where it begins. The ground near the pit shifted, and something began to rise. At first it seemed only a mass of roots, tangled and wet. But as it emerged, the roots twisted into the shape of limbs, too many limbs, bending the wrong way. In the center of the thing, a face bloomed. Blind and grinning, the whispers in their heads turned to screams. Thomas stumbled back. "Mara, we can't fight that. We have to." The creature lunged, its limbs unfurling like ropes. One coiled around Thomas's waist, dragging him toward the pit. He clawed at the floor, screaming. Mara ran forward, the blade raised. She swung at the limb, slicing deep. Black ichor sprayed, hissing where it touched the stone. The creature recoiled, but its laughter echoed inside her skull. She knew then. This wasn't just a thing living beneath the house. This was the heart of the house. The walls above were its skin, the floors its bones. And it wanted out. The silver blade pulsed once more, faint but insistent. Mara realized the truth. It wasn't a weapon meant for the creature. It was a key. She dropped to her knees beside the pit, ignoring Thomas's shouts. She raised the blade high and drove it into the center of the black stone rim. A crack split outward from the point of impact, racing across the chamber floor. The knocking stopped. Then came a scream, not from the creature, but from the walls themselves. The ceiling shuddered. Rocks and earth rained down. The creature writhed, limbs thrashing wildly. Its grip on Thomas loosened, and he scrambled free. Mara, it's collapsing. Good, she shouted. It dies with the house. The pit glowed from within, a pale, searing light that grew brighter with every heartbeat. The creature tried to retreat, dragging itself toward the tunnel, but the floor beneath it split open. One limb brushed Mara's ankle, cold as ice, strong as iron, before the pit's light swallowed it whole. Thomas grabbed her arm. "We have to go now." They ran. The tunnel behind them groaned, stone and flesh tearing apart. The archway crumbled the moment they crossed back into the cellar. They bolted up the wooden stairs as the house wailed like a dying animal. The front door was already ajar, the wind howling through. They stumbled outside into the night, falling to their knees on the cold grass. Behind them, the house shivered once, then folded inward, collapsing into itself without sound, leaving only a gaping hole in the earth. The air was still again. The moon broke through the clouds. Thomas turned to Mara, his face pale but alive. "Is it gone?" Mara stared at the black hole where the house had been. She wanted to say yes. But somewhere, faint and distant, she thought she heard it, the slow, steady sound of breathing. The end, or is it? If you enjoyed this story and want more chilling tales that keep you turning pages deep into the night, subscribe, share this with your friends, and leave a comment with your favorite part. Your support helps bring the next nightmare to life. Sleep tight, if you can.